So let me start by first doing this sort of moronic thing. What really is development? I think we basically understand it as changing economic and social capacities, priorities, and choices. That's what we try to do. That's what we try to achieve by various interventions. So it's really basic services in this part of the world. It's about water, it's about security, it's about electricity, it's about education. It's doing things to people, giving out and doing stuff. And we hope that that creates some kind of systematic growth and advancement in well-being over time. And somehow, we believe that the scale of what we call development is commensurate to the interventions that we put in. That there's some kind of a linear relationship between building roads and trade and all of these things that are supposed to happen. Between free primary education as a supply side of things to kids actually learning. We made these very simplistic assumptions, which are pretty problematic. So when we do development, we proceed from some really simple things. We try to define things, what the problem is, what the opportunity is, and it's the world of experts, like I said. The health guys will say what is important, and if an ecologist like me shows up, they'll say, hey, you don't know what you're talking about. And they tell me to go and stick another one. And then we use that as a basis for priority setting, okay? Then we formulate some kind of an action frame that designs the action space. And then we put some money on it. We implicate the public. We implicate development partners. We implicate the global collective through the SDGs, for instance, UNDP, etc. Then we start to grapple with implementation. How do we get it done? And then sometimes we show up and try to evaluate what happened. And we never want, that's the part we want to talk about. Okay? But then we go back full cycle again and start doing the same thing. Pose new questions, and we're always supplying things, but we don't look at the efficacy of that supply process and the outcomes. So what we want to do is normal. It is normal. Nobody can question the intention of the development community. You know, their heart is in the right place. They want to change human well-being and livelihood outcomes. They want better health, they want better education, and they want more income. And we've been very clever at even designing the indicators for that, which you can measure very rigorously. Every so often, we give you the World Development Report. I'll tell you the league table of the world, this is so and so, 0 point this, 0 point that, and we create a conversation about it. And then we go back and we start to do this again. So the question is, when is everyone going to end? But part of the reason there's a problem in the way that we've been doing this is because development is really the 6 blind experts trying to do something. And each of them extraordinarily educated and with a ton of evidence for everything they're holding and saying this is the truth. So look at this guy sitting there. He looks really clever and with a lot of experience. He's holding the task and he's saying it's a spear. And I'm sure he can swear on his children's hand. And he can show you his thesis and all his publications that basically prove that what he's holding is a spear. The same thing with this other gentleman who's up here. It's a wall. And he can tell you how walls are built. In terms of the texture, he can give you all the material functions of those walls, the strength and everything. You can cost it. Then someone is holding the tail and they say it's a rope. So this really underlines most of the issues that we have on the outcome side of the investments that we make in this so-called development space. And believe me, all these guys go home every day and they're so happy with what they've accomplished and they think they're so right in everything that they've achieved. So the question really is, now is the time for a paradigm shift, because previously the reason why we subsisted in this suboptimal space is because we just didn't know. There was just not enough capacity for data, for information, for networking, for understanding, for partnership, etc. So there's an excuse. There's a perfect excuse not to know, and you think that your neck of the woods is the universe. Now, that time is over, because advances in big data analytics and complexity science now tell us that there's a different way. There's a different way to understand and reconfigure the world and understand how we intervene in that space. So we think about it as an unstruggling development because we've made it such a complex thing that nobody even knows what constitutes it. So we want to now kind of break this apart. And what we've done, and when Jason and I first had a conversation, we said one of the things we want to show is that yes, there is a dearth of data. That's no doubt. But what are we doing with what we have? Let's start from there and then push for new data. Because the fast and easy excuse when I go to many meetings, as I was talking to some this morning, I said, the thing that I hear, especially when donors are sitting around the room, capacity development. We need money for capacity, and yes, we need money for data. But nobody talks about what we're doing with the data that we have. And all of this is publicly available from Kenya National Bureau of Statistics. So it's not a mystery that we can use what we have. So what we've done over the last 5 months is look at the data that is publicly available across about 48 variables. And by count, now that we have this great invention of the new constitution, which is really cool. And then we looked at so many data sets, including the socioeconomic atlas. Some of the data is secondary collated by other people, but of course in collaboration with National Bureau of Statistics. So this is data that we can stand by. We didn't make it up. It is what it is. And the sources are there. We're happy to provide all of that so you can actually verify these things. So what we're basically trying to figure out is, given the data that we have, can we look at the footprint and the results of development interventions in this country? Because the government has been doing a lot of development. Donors are killing themselves in places like northern Kenya, risking everything. The people who've abandoned their families in the West and come here to live in these very hard conditions to do development, to change lives, to make a difference. So what we've done across those 48 variables is to basically try and make sense of what are the patterns of those outcomes. And the outcome level, when you do something, you're trying to change things like health, you're trying to change economics, you're trying to change literacy levels. So we looked at things like across these variables and subjected this to multivariate statistical tools, and in this case we use principal component analysis, and just look at the first 6 that explained most of the variability among the 47 counties, and then decided to see what does it throw out there. So the first 2 components, this PC1 and PC2, explain around 66% of variability. So we are confident that that is sufficiently robust to distinguish the difference among the counties in a consistent way, in a way that you can now track down to specific variable outcomes that come as a result of development or lack of development, investment or lack of investment, skewed investment or consistent and equitable investment. So around child mortality, for instance, you'll see that, in principle component 3 that explains, 5 explains most of the variability in child mortality, if you look at maternal mortality, but it's not the discrete and individual differences across those components that is important. It is a combination of the various components and the patterns that they produce that is important. And this is what it looks like. So the first one is actually beginning to use a dendrogram, which is a classification algorithm that then gives you the counties. So what you see here is the counties of Kenya. And what it has done is it created several branches that distinguishes. It takes the data, looks at them across those components, looks at the differences and the similarities, and starts some kind of a clustering. Which counties fall together, which counties fall apart, and then you can use those 48 variables then to see along what variable axis do these differences occur. This is what is interesting. My pointer doesn't work pretty well on this screen. So what happens here is the first principal component that explains about 48 and the other one about 18. So on this axis, you see all these things. It separates the counties by distance to health facility, mother's education, sanitation, weight for age, 2 standard deviations from that, maternal mortality, and fertility. So it kicks out the counties separately. So you see the ones that are clustered on this side are Turkana, Mandera, Wajir, Samburu, Garissa, Tana River, Marsabit. And the ones on the other side, the Machakos, the Murang'a, Meru, Kiambu, Nyeri, on that side. So it already shows that these are differential outcomes from deliberate or sometimes inadvertent government planning that has created these outcomes. Okay? That somehow, if you live in Tana River, oh my God, you probably will be like 1,500 kilometers from a nearest health clinic. And the mother in many of those households is likely to be uneducated. Okay? And maternal mortality is probably atrocious. But on this other side, again, geography and ecology makes a difference. Arable land becomes a fact that these counties on this side of per capita higher access to arable land. So in that area you have these ones. You have these ones here, Kericho, Wasingishu, Yandarua. And average literacy is another differentiating thing. That all these counties here on the extreme end have higher literacy. And you see these other guys on this side, they're on the extreme end of that variable. And when you look at, say, per capita GDP, access to electricity, facilities density, Nairobi, Mombasa, and all those guys off the charts on that second principal component. So they're doing very well. And the health centers in Nairobi, it's like pretty much down the road everywhere you drive. Mombasa, the same thing. Kajiado, the same thing. And electricity as well. So on this axis, these are the counties that are doing very well. Kiambu, Nyeri, Machakos, Murang'a, Kirinyaga. So you begin to see where the problems might be. And if you're a county guy, and you council of governors, and you try to do your CIDPs, you begin to see intuitively where are the things that you should be focusing on. If you're Mr. Kenyatta, now you know what you should worry about in terms of big infrastructure. What should be the big infrastructure priorities in terms of creating a basis for equalization, for equitable development? If you come here in the middle, maternal mortality is very high on this axis. So again, diarrhea in the places where agroclimate and aridity, these are all the semi-arid counties. Again, it creates an environmental constraint around what you can do from a physical sense. But the problem is that we are all very agrarian. So when you look at the land, we look at the crops. We look at cash crops and food crops. But what about the livestock pastoral capability of these counties? Have we invested enough? Because this is not a constraint. If you look at what is possible, these are pastoral communities. How can we make pastoral work better in those neighborhoods, in those counties? So it begins to kind of ask those kinds of questions. But then what it then creates out of this is what I call a tale of 5 countries. Because these counties kind of like cluster around 5 very neat bubbles once you throw them into that space. So you have all these other guys clustered here with their set of problems, constraints, and opportunities. And then you have all these other guys here also clustered around their constraints and opportunities across those two principal components. Then you have these guys here in the middle. Then you have all these guys, and then you have these guys kind of flying out here on their own. So you begin to look at, even if you're to kind of order spatial development across the counties, you then know where would you go with what kinds of interventions. It gives you a much more robust, repeatable basis for trying to intervene, and a basis for then understanding what is the collective problematic in terms of the things that you must do to actually begin to change things. What is it that is going to change things so that you're not holding just one thing and sticking to it and saying this is the problem. You don't go to Turkana and then you say, yeah, the kids are not going to school because this is the problem. Now, that pattern, therefore, has created certain outcomes. So that in Mandera, for instance, many years of what we've done in this country, if you live in Mandera, you're twice more likely to be illiterate, okay, than if you live in Nyamira. Look at that outcome, for instance. If you're in Mandera, you're more likely to die 3 times more likely to die before your first 5 years of life. So look at this. These things are insane. This is the 21st century. Why are these life chances for kids so differentially inequitable? And then what are we doing with these kinds of things? Because this is the aggregate outcome of all the policies and decisions that we've taken for the last 50 years. This is the outcome. If you look at it from the human development indicators, the outcome, it is the health, it's the education, it is the income. If you live in Mandera, you're 10 times less likely to enroll in secondary school. And now you're told that this is a knowledge economy. So honestly, how can Mandera compete in this globalized knowledge economy? Where will the benefits and the rewards of good education, of a high school education, which is now becoming the most basic level of education, and we've also we're revising our education curriculum to say that a secondary school education is now going to be considered basic education. And that's why we've changed from 844 to 2633, so that the first 3 years, the first 6 plus 3 years, when you exit school, you're about 16. And that's basic education. So every child must go to high school. Now look at the odds that a child in Mandera will go to high school. So I think these are some of the problematic foundational constraints that then make inequitable development almost like preordained, that you cannot change it until you change the substantive logic of development outcomes. In Turkana, for instance, if you're in Turkana, you're 4 times more likely to be poor than if you live in Nairobi. A mother in Turkana is more likely to die due to complications related to childbirth. This is not okay. And I think this has to get into some kind of public conversation in these graphic terms, because it then really makes a difference. And I think what it does, it gives citizens a basis for holding governments accountable. It gives policymakers much more clarity in terms of the priorities that they have to address. So if you're talking about all these level 5 and these big investments in health, Turkana does not need level 5. It needs a skilled birth attendant. Period. How you put that person to work and the resources they need can be debatable, but they don't need a big infrastructure thing to change fundamental life outcomes. Look at that. So look at how this preordination happens. So one, you're a woman, you come from Turkana, you're 4 times as likely to have access to a skilled birth attendant. You're 3 times more likely to be literate if you're in Garissa. You're 7% more likely to have a mother with no formal education. Ways of data shows us that literacy of the mother is strongly correlated with capability in literacy in the early years. Forget laptops. Forget more teachers in schools. Forget all of these things that we talk about. That is a fundamental, invariable, constraining variable. Now, if you're not going to change that, it doesn't matter how much education you give to a child in Wajir, it's never going to work. They'll still never compete in this global economy. So again, I think what it does, it refines our capability to make much more precise decisions about development spending and investments, to focus on the right things to move our societies forward. So I come back to this. So as an ecologist who's trained in complexity, this is like paradise, because we're now telling everybody else that maybe the most important discipline to study is ecology, because it helps you to understand how things work together. This idea of an ecosystem that we all learned, that things work and they're interdependent, and one condition that affects another one. If you put a seed inside a hole that has fertilizer and water and all of these things, and there's sunshine, something's going to happen, something's going to grow. So that habitat, there has to be some habitat around which development operates and around which livelihood outcomes are more accessible. So I think there's no more excuse around grappling with what it is or what is it. We should forget about that and say it is the elephant, and the elephant has components, and each of those things are important for an elephant to function. The elephant needs legs, it needs a body, it needs a tail, it needs a trunk, it needs its ears. So let's not create this atomization in terms of development work that basically puts people in the very separate corners. Even if they do, now with technology and with big data, we can now talk together. We can now share what we know. So development is complex and it is wicked. And it is so because oftentimes, as we've seen, the problem is very difficult to define. And as these guys have demonstrated, individual perspectives are very different. And everybody is so insistent on what they know. I have the tail, that's what I think the elephant is. I have the ear, that's what I think it is. And every problem can be considered as a symptom. Okay? So if you're talking about, say, low levels of enrollment in primary school, that's not the fundamental problem in Nigeria. The fundamental problem probably lies somewhere else. The mother didn't have education. It probably lies in the first 1,000 days. Not enough nutrition, therefore cognitive impairment. So the kids can't learn, they can't pay attention, they can't stay in the classroom. So you need to go somewhere else. And I think that's what this data is showing, that things must not be taken at face value. The other one is that problems co-evolve. The elements in the system change and transform through interaction. Okay, so there are many things that it's almost like a path dependence process. So what you're next to, the connectivity and the topology, all of those things matter. But the most important thing is this path dependence. So for instance, if you go back to this slide, you can actually see path dependence at play. You know, if you're a child in Garissa and in Wajir and your mother was illiterate, chances are that you'll never go beyond high school. You'll not be able to succeed in the early years in education. So that preordains your path, and it makes some of these problems intergenerational. Because you'll be a mother, you get a little mother to another child, and that child will also have the same difficulties unless something else changes. So you can get yourself in what many in development like to talk about as a lock-in or a trap. And it's very difficult to get in there, to get out of that trap until something drastic happens. You change some fundamental variable conditions to break that up. You come in with, say, adult literacy to then educate the mothers, then the mothers can now support the kids. So again, if you're working in Wajir, free primary education cannot be by itself. It has to be accompanied by adult literacy, especially for mothers who have kids in grade school, for instance. So I think it's just creating this not so comfortable space for policymakers to think in much more complex ways. But they don't have to do this on their own. The partnerships and the data and all this other space is there for them to support that process. So policy making then becomes much more nuanced and becomes much more sophisticated rather than simplistic. So here's an interesting slide. So for instance, if you look at just poverty and everything else that surrounds it. So if you're telling me that your job as an organization is poverty alleviation, you know, I'll laugh out of the house because I don't think you know what you're talking about. If all you're doing is working with SMEs and you're so sure, it is the elephant problem again, you're so sure that that's going to alleviate poverty. Or if the other thing that you're doing is building bridges or building cattle leaves, then you're very sure that you're alleviating poverty. So the whole thing is really, how do we think about the entire ecosystem, the habitat factors that actually create poverty as an outcome? Poverty is not the thing. It is a symptom of, it is a syndrome. Let me put it that way. There are many, many things that constitute what that outcome is. It's like HIV and AIDS. HIV and AIDS is not a condition. It is a condition, it's not a disease by itself. There's so many things. It's a critical impairment of your immune system. And that then makes it easy for anything else to attack you. Okay? So, to start dealing with AIDS by itself becomes, it's a cocktail of things. So you've got to find a way to cut beneath that and deal with these things if you're going to deal with things like poverty. You know, how do you deal with early nutrition in the first 1,000 days? How do you deal with issues around maternal mortality? How do you deal with mothers' education? How how do you deal with land productivity? Not to call it land arability, but productivity of any land that you have, whether it is pastoral, semi-arid, or land that is in the humid tropics with 2 seasons of rain. And the other one is also this. Like, for instance, the number of out-of-school children is strongly correlated to adult literacy, distance to school, improved access to sanitation, nutrition, the incidence of poverty, education of mothers, and the quality of education. So it's an entire ecosystem of things that we must change to basically get this number. So if you show up at one place and you say the more kids out of school who are above the age of being in school, and all you do is throwing school buildings into the space, it's not going to change the problem. So what we're seeing from this data that is publicly available is a basis for a very different conversation in terms of how we prioritize development opportunities and what kinds of questions that we ask. And the other one is, again, this special concentration of poverty traps. Again, I think this is also a fundamental failure of an agrarian development ideology, which basically calls, one time I was sitting at a meeting with former late P.S. Nalo, and he pulled out some sessional paper and he said this characterized Kenya in terms of its development domains, and there's some places that are called marginal. And I told him, no, you're wrong. There's no marginal place on the planet. It is only marginal when you do the wrong things there. When you do the right things there, they're not marginal. These societies, the past societies, have existed there for thousands of years until we showed up and tried to change the logic of landholding there and how land is used, because the lifeblood of pastoralism is movement. Once you start to constrain that with all these conflict things and these land grabs and all these political things, you kill pastoralism. But if you let those land holdings and the traditional setup function, it will not end up this way. So we've created this artificial policy, political economy traps in our system that we need to break and go back to the fundamental capabilities of the land systems. But I want to end with 2 questions, which I think at the end of this process I started thinking about and saying, with data and complexity thinking, looking at how things are related and how depends on these local ideas, how do we best identify and ask questions that guide research, guide policy, and development to achieve inclusive, sustainable, systemic change? It has to be systemic change. It can't be just cosmetic change. It can't be putting 2 kids in school. It has to be a system that makes sure that thousands of kids can come to school because thousands of mothers are literate. And hundreds of thousands of teachers show up in school buildings and work. So it can't be one thing that we do. And I think this is the big problem with even the structure of a political conversation around political cycles, with manifestos of parties that come in and they just have one thing. Laptops, salary, jewelry, and I don't remember what Kibaki used to have, Thika Road and stuff like that. It is this one thing that does not change a bunch of things that are necessary to change. And I think the other question is, and this is really where this group is important in terms of the partnerships we create out of this and how we work together going forward, is what approaches and processes and investments in policy, implementation and result measurement. Because I think there's a fundamental problem in how we measure outcomes of the things that we've done. And the reason we go back and do the wrong things all the time is because we don't learn to change and rethink our theory of change, if we have one at all. And that's why there's no transformational change. Because we do one thing, like for instance, now we believe for sure that 2 things will solve this massive youth unemployment. One thing is to send these young people to the farms. The other one is to convert all of them into businessmen. Those 2 things, if we have them, we can all hold hands and say kumbaya, because the problem is solved, and young people will be so happy and will love us so much because they're businessmen and they're farmers. Now the question is, where is the evidence for that? And we keep doing this. Uganda, Tanzania, Kenya, Rwanda are pouring billions of their currencies in youth funds and all of these empowerment funds for young people. I was reading the other day, I think this is data that came from somebody who did a review, and they just did about 4 counties, so it's a highly dodgy. But he said only 34% of the applications for youth funds were actually spent on the proposals that they sent out when they applied for the funds. Most of them use the money for other things. But we're still pouring money into the same. You know, Irene and I have been talking about this. The failure rate of businesses is over 50% within the first year. That's the mortality rate of new businesses from startup. They don't celebrate their third birthdays. 50% of them just get killed. They get wiped out. But we don't ask those questions. We don't ask why we're still pouring money into those things. You know, young people don't want to go into agriculture. That's for sure. And agriculture is tough. Look at the weather today. I just have grass outside my house and I worry every day when it's going to rain. How about if you have millions of shillings in the field of crop, of seed, and fertilizer, and labor that is going to go because the rains haven't come on time? Which young man is going to wait for that kind of uncertainty? So I think this is really where we need to go in terms of how do we do simultaneously data analytics but also policy analytics in terms of the efficacy and the outcomes of the big policy investments that we make? And how do we make sure that development policy can be as precise as the science that it must be? Because we have all the tools, we have all the data to basically understand that if you do this, you need to think about this and that. And what Alicia did first was just take all those forget variables and run random correlations. And you see what hangs together and what is not related to anything. That is not rocket science. Even before you come to the sophisticated multivariate stuff that Caleb does, you know, there are many ways to just basically get sense of what it is. And then to create, you know, visually compelling graphics like this that then enjoy a much more comprehensive conversation. Because this is what I actually like to talk about. This is easy to understand. This is very easy to understand. This is so easy to understand. And this is when they'll start knocking the doors of the governor and of the Minister for Devolution and asking them, what is going on? I think this as a basis for social accountability is a powerful tool. And I think this is where we, as Aga Khan University and the resources that we have, the time we're dedicating to this is what we want to do. We want to make sure that data can be translated into everyday conversation, that people can then now use to hold policymakers to account, but also for policymakers to see much more clearly where development priorities must go, and also learn to measure the results and outcomes of their investments. Because I'm sure Mr. Kenyatta is sitting there and is spending these billions of shillings. I think sometimes he worries about, what am I getting for the bound? Is there a bound on my back? And why are we not getting anybody? Why does Wezo tell us consistently that 30% of the kids in class 4 cannot read and write? And if you take the aggregate computation in education, clearly it is money down the drain because it is not delivering anything. And if you're a smart investor, take the money, put it in your pocket, cut those guys out in the next budget cycle. Because why am I paying you? Until you come back to me with a better idea. So I think this results-based budgeting is what we can actually drive at. And where the government can now then pull money where we're not getting a return on taxpayers' investments. And now if you tell taxpayers, like for instance, if you look at the evidence in Nairobi, and Ipsos has done this, at the time a household earns 40,000 shillings, they pull their kids out of public school. You know, schools in Nairobi are depopulating. But nobody doesn't want to talk about this. NAC doesn't want to talk about this. Why are we still putting money in free primary education in Nairobi at those competition numbers that are made up by principals and head teachers? Why not put these things into private schools that then will be more inclusive, that then bring in the kids from marginalized families and raise the standards for everyone? Why can't we rethink the delivery of basic education? I think the data is out there. You know, the work that Hayema did, the former principal of Alliance, is a thick book on my desk that gives all these statistics about Nairobi schools, but nobody wants to look at the data. And as Catherine would say, they don't want you to know that, because then you're going to get one inch to start paying at the door and say, I should ask Matiani, why are we spending money in public schools in Nairobi when the kids are not going there? The schools are getting depopulated, the class sizes are so small, and we're still putting money in free primary education. Why can't we change the model of delivering education? What are the public-private partnerships that we can get into through charter schools and all these grants to public schools that then raise the standards for everyone? Because as Wezo tells you, kids in certain schools are not learning. There's inequitable distribution of teacher resources, for instance. Teacher absenteeism in public schools is off the charts. When you look at some of these delivery statistics. So I think what this is just basically doing is, can we ask for more in-depth questions? Can we be more nuanced about policy formulation? Can there be new areas for policy experimentation? Like this funding of primary schools, you could actually start with a small experiment and see whether it simultaneously raises the standards, but also gives the taxpayer better value for the money. Because I'm happy to pay those taxes if kids are actually learning. But I'm going to put money, even for young kids, when they're not learning, I'll pull that back. So to give taxpayers more choices and options in decision making. So with that, I will shut up. And we can ask the questions. Okay, so Elisa, you guide us in terms of what we're supposed to do, whether it's just some goals and there's questions afterwards.
I think we can probably start with some questions now if anyone had any pressing thoughts they wanted to get on Alex's presentation. Yeah,
so Alex,
yes.
Are you planning to be a political consultant?
I love my day job. Thank you very much.
I think you keep working like this, one of the presidential candidates will be on your case.
Oh my God, I hate these guys.
You not of the manifesto and then get rid of you after that. But I think this is very revolutionary, and it's certainly the way to think about development in the future. So not even in the future, you should have been thinking about it this way. And I have a comment and a question. Now, if this is the way the development in this country should be happening, the planning, the assumption is that the planning should be preceded by have you participated in any government planning, when you're doing annual plans and budgeting process? What the starts like a study?
No, I only come with the jail and when they get the budget policy statement. Maybe Jason has.
Yes, that's problem number one, because we have an annual planning cycle that starts on August every year, ends with the budget in June. We actually do it backwards. We first budget and then we plan. So, like,
plan to spend the money.
Yeah. So the budget by now, when you're speaking, the budget is complete, and then we start planning after that. So it's backward. You start in the tail and then you go to there. But then I think for me the question is, it's basically done by people in the public sector who sit down, and it's activity-based budgeting. All your 20 million shillings put in activities for this year. So how can we, so these are very enriching environment, and I think you've heard me talk a lot about, in other countries they talk about the triple helix. You get together the government, the academia, which will represent the academia, the business sector, and we sit around the table, analyze data, for example, for accounting, and then based on that accounting, we develop a plan together. Because the government have their own role, the academia have their own role, and the business sector, because the civil sector have their own role. And I think the only way we can begin making progress is we have that round table. When we have that, we'll be having actually a summit on the 4th of April, 4th to 6th. That we're starting that conversation around refugees. But what you are saying is spot on, and I think the question is, how can we begin moving toward that direction where all we sit on the table, analyze data and plan? Because I think that's really...
Yeah, so Mike, that's actually really the public. So when I reached out to Jason, it was really to try and build a data community in Nairobi, an evidence community in Nairobi. And that's why we have our colleagues from the media here to say, how can we all do this together? With some of the new data that we're collecting through surveys. In fact, Roesa and us are working very closely. We started looking at the education data, and I think once we do that, it's going to have much more work. And when I spoke with Chef yesterday, we were talking about this as a tool for social accountability. How do you get the people who really bear the brunt of bad policy making, misallocation of public resources, to start having a conversation about this must change? And how do we as researchers then begin to ask different questions? Because I think sometimes we're also very lazy. And this country, I'm sorry, is done by consultants, which is terrible. And so how do we get these resources back into these kinds of spaces where we have the luxury of time to think about these things, make some mistakes, ask new questions, and do this differently? So what we're really trying to do is that we haven't called you this on a one-off. This is not one of those meetings that, oh yeah, we're in the meeting. We're trying to create a community and say, can we now? And I'm glad the colleague from the National Bureau of Statistics is here. So that next year, we can actually start this process. I was saying to a friend of mine that this 2017, to me, is a transition year. If we cross this bridge, can we as citizens now begin to build the basis for accountability in the country? Even the wonderful constitution that we celebrate all the time, can we now create those mechanisms of holding all these guys accountable? This country will not rise or fall because of its leaders. It will rise or fall because of the citizens who basically surrendering their responsibilities to hold government accountable. And creating this community is the first step, because then we're the translators. Jason and I were having this joke and saying, we have the luxury to read this BPS. How many people will read that material? Who even care about it? But we have that luxury. And then now we have the community to then use this and then find the channels through our friends in the media to then take this out in public conversations and engagements to basically carry on the debate. And I think this is a vital duty that we have as citizens. And then building this community creates that beginning. When we have the civil society and the development partners who are working on these issues, and we have government, we have academia, we have our friends from the media, we have everyone that we need. We have people who are crunching this data. How can this data be refined and amplified by some of the work that Ipsos does? Can this now get Ipsos or Wesa to go in a certain direction that deepens an understanding with much more granular data? Because we don't have sub-national data. We'd have loved to give you what these counties look like within themselves. And I'm sure that there's some parts of Turkana that look like Kiambu. There's certain parts of Kiambu that look like Turkana. We want to know which ones are these. So I think if we can form this community, I think that's an important first step to actually move towards more accountable, responsible governance and investment and development allocations. Yes, please.
Kudos to you and your team for this. This is, we're putting now words to some of the things I've been thinking about. I've been saying that we need a caricature of the poorest person in every county. Before, because if we change the quality of life for that person, then everything changes at all. But the tendency has been the counties are focused so much on the creme de la creme counties, more than the person at the poorest. But so looking at the 5 countries that you had identified here, to be interesting.
I'm not breaking up the country.
No, but in the sense of, because they help us discuss now, the urgency of now. What would you say are the inequalities that, or things that are informing? Because I was looking at it, there's one which is the bottom, because heavily, you could easily say it's where like the court conversation, the coalitions are around the issue, they're around. So if you have to put holes into the discourse, what would you say? And because for me, that's where, it can inform the politics that we are going through now. And have a different conversation, or maybe move it a bit slightly in the less current direction.
I think that's a very difficult question in terms of where one might start, because these things have been like 60 years in the making. It's built in the way that we understand the country. It's built in the way that our policymakers are trained. Like I gave that example of David Nalo talking about marginalized. And it comes from a policy document that was presented before cabinet and discussed in parliament. That designated counties, certain parts of the country as marginal. That means that we will not do anything there. And you can see why there are no hospitals there, why there are no roads there, why there's no electricity there. Maternal mortality, is it Garissa or Mandera? Mandera is the same as South Sudan or Somalia? It's higher than Somalia. So how does that even work? HIV/AIDS in Homa Bay is higher than the country with the highest frequency, Swaziland. And how many millions of dollars? We even have a national AIDS council. So why aren't we asking the questions around these things? So I think really the thing that will cause us to bring back these 5 countries into one unit is if we start asking questions on allocations. And I don't think that the experience with the counties now is encouraging. Because I was in Turkana about 6 months ago, and the governor is putting up a mansion worth 200 million. So it shows you where the priorities are. And I don't know how that allocation was made against all those competing priorities. So I think that's a problem by itself. And then you look at all of the monies that have been spent on benchmark trips and all of these things. So sometimes I wonder whether maybe this is one data point, which is this one election cycle, is enough to say that we have some real problems with the structure of county governments. Or whether we need to ask deeper questions about the possibility that these units can actually drive meaningful change. That each one of those county governors has a sense that they're in one of those 5 countries. And I think 3 out of those 5 countries are not a good place to be. Okay? So only 2 of those are reasonable places, especially for children and for mothers. The kinds of investments that need to be made, I think, are investments that must be qualified in development plans. And if you look at the CADPs, the county integrated development plans, those things read the same, like from nearly every county. They're probably done with the same consultant, they come from the Ministry of Pollution, the template is given to them, and they're also constrained by that. I read the one for Turkana, the first one that came out, it did not even mention oil. The first CADP for Turkana did not even mention oil, they did not even mention a new economy, they did not even mention the human capital that needs to be built to harness those oil resources. So it just tells you how disconnected everything else. And as Michael said, you first do the budget, then we do the plan. So sometimes you're stuck with money, you don't know what to do with it, and that's why you plug it in all these places. So I think the image of the 5 countries is really unfortunate, but it is what it is. And I think the question really is how we start to rig the basic infrastructure and investment and policy decisions that stitches the country together in one whole and gets us out of this. Because those life chances that we've shown for kids and mothers is completely atrocious, and the chances are that it will continue that way. As long as the conversation is still stuck at level 5 also of hospitals, with General Electric cancer machines, and not at the level of a skilled birth attendant, which is what is there in Garissa, in Mandera, in Wajir, and in some parts of Pokot. So that's where we really need to go. Can we focus on the basics that are needed to build this going up, and say what are the constitutive structures around that, around nutrition? Those counties have some of the worst numbers of stunted, because again we label them marginal, and we're not going there with resources to support the pastoral, the livestock economy. So they're basically in this cycle of constant handouts and malnutrition and all of these things, which again diminish their potential to compete in a knowledge-based economy. So the kids will not finish school, the mothers will most likely be illiterate, and then you get into this lock-in path dependence public trust. So that's why I think it's a very complex question, because it requires that we open up everything and have some really candid conversations, and even begin to examine the planning and thinking capability of some of the county, the human capital of some of the counties. Does it mean that some of these counties need to be administered by the central government? Can they trust the central government to make those decisions for them because they don't have capacity?
So I think we'll take one more question now, but after the tea break, we will have the opportunity to kind of tell us more about the work that you're doing and give us more of your insights as well. Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think I want to come into this from a civil society point of view, and I keep thinking that, the civil societies out there bring all this work in this county, whether it's adult literacy, issues of fertility, issues of basic education. We are out there doing the basics. So what is it, why is it that it's not changing? Why is it that these poverty incidences are not changing? And yet the civil society is doing so much, there's so much money being poured into the counties, into the grassroots to ensure that all these problems are actually dealt with. So I think we still go back to that issue of structural changes that we need, because I don't think it's more money that needs to be poured over there. I don't think it's more needs assessments that need to be done, because we've done a lot of needs assessment, and we kind of do understand that some of these, poverty is not, you can't look at poverty just from an education point of view. They are all interconnected, and therefore you find that a lot of organizations, when they go to the ground, they're actually implementing interconnected projects and activities to ensure that they alleviate these people from that kind of poverty, and yet it is not changing. And I guess then we need to go back to these discussions of what is wrong with the policies that we have in place again, and what are those structural issues that need to be addressed, because I don't think it's more money that needs to be poured onto the ground.
So from the question of what's wrong with the policies in Kenya, my answer is nothing is wrong with the policies in Kenya, because most of the policy documents that we have are pretty standard, because consultants just cut and paste them from other countries. Okay, so they're pretty standard. The question is the development hypothesis that we toss. Then we place the policies to start dealing with those. The questions that we ask, and then say what policy instruments should we assign these kinds of things, and then the implementation arrangements. Okay, and as I say, the habitat conditions for those investments to succeed is not right. If you're going to intervene with, say, microfinance and lending to women, when markets don't work, how is it possible inputs don't work and it's an agricultural setting? When the cost of fertilizer, somebody said it's easier to get a bottle of Coke in an African village than to get a bag of fertilizer. When those market imperfections exist, for instance, the roads don't work, there's no agricultural advisory services in those places, land tenure isn't even, for instance, women don't have rights to land. So there are all of these things that then upset everything else that the NGOs are trying to do, because women's rights to property is still an issue. Markets are probably not working, for instance, and all the other enabling conditions are not working. We don't have space to design credible, believable contracts around credit, for instance. If you lend me money and you give me your title deed, is that good enough? For instance, in rural areas, ancestral land, you can't take to the bank. So there are many things, and as Anand sort of say, land in Africa is dead capital. So there are all of these things that we need to capitalize and regularize in the system to begin to make other things operate. So this idea of mimicking a liberal market economy that we keep doing all the time, it's not real when certain things are not working. So then you make this investment and you run into the brick wall of the other one. And again, part of it is, if you look at development as a series of, if you look at policy as a series of development experiments in terms of the implementation, the question is, what do we learn from those experiments? I think we had plenty of time to learn from the free primary education since 2003. There should have been some evaluation 2 years after that to basically see what happened. We were sitting here and public schools were depopulated and we did nothing. But we still kept the competition. We're still saying we need more teachers. When Sosion says we need 5,000 more teachers, I always ask myself, where are these teachers going to go? Where in public schools are depopulated? So the question is, do we have the good sense to do the monitoring, the results measurements, and the evaluation, and ask the hard questions, and course correct some of the policy formulations that we've had? Why we think that once we decide that it's free primary education, we can't change it? Who says that we can't change our minds? Who says that we can't have a better idea? Who says we cannot question government delivery processes and say you need different partners? Maybe you need to bring some of these education entrepreneurs into the system, give them a school and see if they can run as a charter school. What happens? You know, some people have shown that untrained teachers who left school in fourth form actually make better teachers, and the students do much better in those subjects in those schools where they're working. Now, what do you need to make them certified? What do you need as a certification process so these teachers can then meet the requirements of the unions, because the unions are going to run them out of school. TSC doesn't recognize it. But how do you create another system that then creates a different incentive? They'll cost less, they'll be much more effective, and they'll be more learning. So how about you start creating this random experiments in the school system, for instance, and then see what really is working, and then put public policy and public investments around that. So I think the answer to your question really is we need to be more experimental in our processes, and I think data needs to be much more important in informing policy formulations, in asking the questions, but we also need data in understanding implementation. There has to be some data that is collected during implementation. Data is not just for research to guide new policy, but data is also to refine implementation of existing policy. Create that pressure for reevaluating and course correcting the direction of existing policy formulations. So,
Thanks for that, Alex.